Hello and welcome to The Brief, a video podcast that explores vital issues and events in international affairs and brings you some perspective and analysis. I'm your host, Jim Clancy. More than a year after Hamas stunned Israel with a brazen attack on soldiers and civilians, the conflict rages on. The top leaders of Hamas have all been killed, we're told. The same is true for another militant group in Lebanon, Hezbollah. But the killing of innocent civilians, Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanese across the border hasn't ended. Rocket fire has claimed more Israeli victims, too. There is no ceasefire. There have been reported cutoffs or curtailments of humanitarian aid and medical supplies, and Israel has barred half a dozen more aid groups from sending any more doctors or nurses into Gaza. Our guest for this edition of The Brief is on the record saying it is all part and parcel of a colonization effort, a long, bitter, and bloody one. It's not new, and it's not over. Professor Rashid Khalidi is Edward Said Professor Emeritus of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He's written a book about it, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. Professor Khalidi, hello, and welcome to The Brief.
Thanks for having me.
You know, as we look at this, I don't think anyone expected this conflict to go so long. And certainly many thought that once people like Yaya Sinwar were eliminated from the scene, somehow, some way, there would be a ceasefire. But none has been coming. Where do we stand?
Well, I think you're right. Nobody expected this to go this long. But anyone who expected that the elimination of leaders, whether Said Hassan Nasrallah or Yahya Sinwar, would lead to any change in the situation was deluding themselves. This is going to go on. Israel has decided to reoccupy Gaza. There will be a prolonged insurgency there. Israel seems to intend to occupy part of South Lebanon. There will be a renewed insurgency there. And unless and until there's a very forceful external intervention, Israel seems determined to go on, at least for the immediate future. So there is no end in sight to the slaughter of huge numbers of civilians who are, being killed as we speak in Lebanon and especially in Gaza. And there seems to be no restraint being imposed on Israel.
That's been the major criticism of the Biden administration throughout the conflict, that it has not actively done what is needed in order to rein in Israel. There's been a lot of talk, but there hasn't been any action. And the action that, of course, everybody's talking about is cut off the arms. If you look at the kinds of weapons that were delivered, the 2,000-pound bunker buster, blockbuster bombs, those used in an area like Gaza that is so overwhelmingly crowded by civilians, is just a formula for the kind of carnage we've seen.
I think the United States and especially the Western European countries as well, but the international community could and should have done much more. Obviously the U.S. is the prime. The U.S. is a participant in this. It's not simply an enabler or complicit. It's not simply weapons. The United States is jointly targeting leaders of Hezbollah and leaders of Hamas, according to press reports. There's some kind of joint operations room. So the United States is a participant, and there's an enormous range of things that could be done, up to and including restraining arms shipments by a number of countries. And there does not seem to be any international will to do anything to uphold international humanitarian law, to hold Israel to the kinds of standards that supposedly countries are supposed to be held to. This flimsy excuse of human shields. There were human shields covering 42,000 Gazans? It simply does not. It's not logical, and it is clear. These are clearly things that, if anyone had any respect for international humanitarian law, would have been brought to a halt long ago. But clearly, this idea of some kind of global, international, liberal, rules-based order is a fantasy in the mind of American politicians and diplomats. They don't really mean it, and what we've been seeing over the past year proves it conclusively. I think this is a terrible. It makes the United States look appalling that it participates in this and allows it to continue.
Well, one of the myths, you want to say, was all of that about human shields, and Yaya Sinwar was supposed to be hiding out surrounded by Israeli hostages so he couldn't be killed, and yet the video came out and he appeared to be sitting in a living room when he was dazed by a tank round, whatever it was, but it showed him defiant up until the end. How is he going to be remembered in this? The Israelis have cast him in the absolute worst possible light. Palestinians and Arabs on the street don't seem to share that opinion.
No, I think you're right. And there are press reports that say exactly what you're saying, that throughout the Arab world, Muslim world, I think much of the global South as well, he will be seen to have died a hero's death. He's obviously reviled in Israel and in the sectors of the American elites that are supportive of Israel. But overall, I think that actually his decision not to take what the Wall Street Journal reported today was an offer from Egypt to leave Gaza and to stay. And the way in which the Israelis have just showed us he died probably burnishes his image. And probably will inspire other people. Meaning that what Israel has been doing for decades in systematically assassinating Palestinian leaders is going to have no more positive effect in this case than it has had over the past decades. And it's not like this has stopped anything. Whether you like what the Palestinians have done or not, clearly the kinds of assassinations that Israel is so proud of have zero effect, except possibly motivating other people to do even more than the ones who've been killed before them.
Well, there was a lot of attention, and the Biden administration, I'm starting to see, is still pushing this idea of a separate peace with Saudi Arabia, naming Saudi Arabia as the new, leader of the Middle East, of the Arabs in the Middle East. And yet, you look back at what Jared Kushner did, the Abraham Accords, and not much evidence they did anything good for this region.
They were meant to shaft the Palestinians, and they did that. And I would guess one of the consequences of the Abraham Accords was this attack by Hamas. In other words, seeing the United States pushing the region in this direction, seeing a willingness on the part of some Arab leaderships to go along with that, they reacted as they did. And I think that there was that intention, or at least that inclination on the part of Arab leaderships to follow what the Emiratis and the Moroccans and the Bahrainis did in normalizing relations with Israel. The idea of a peace treaty between Morocco and Israel is ludicrous. They were never at war. Peace treaty between Bahrain and Israel, they were never at war. In fact, Bahrain and the Emirates didn't even exist when Israel came into existence. But normalization of relations was, I think, acceptable to a lot of Arab leaderships, and probably no longer will be, or at least will not be for a very long time, in light of the horror at what Israel is seen daily to be doing in Gaza, something that the mainstream media protects Americans who follow it from seeing, but everybody else in the world, including young people across the United States, are seeing it daily on their phones and their devices. And that is going to restrain those Arab leaderships that might have wanted to follow the path of the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco. They have public opinion, even in jackboot dictatorships, even in complete absolute monarchies that have there's no permission for public dissent. They're still afraid of their public opinion. And I don't think that public opinion is going to look kindly on countries normalizing with the Israel that has just slaughtered 40, 50,000 people in Gaza and 2,000 people and counting in Lebanon.
When we look at this, and this is in your book, you talk about how those authoritarian regimes continue to function. There's all this talk about democracy, but really the status quo here depends on those regimes because they, as you note, they don't have the support of the street on this issue.
Exactly. I mean, I think you put your finger on it, actually. The lack of democracy in the Arab world is a condition for Israeli hegemony over this region. If public opinion were allowed to express itself, if there were democratic governance in most Arab countries, which is not the case, there is democratic governance barely in one or two or three of them at best. If you had democratic governance and free expression, the situation would be entirely different. oil-producing countries would put pressure on the United States to stop this. Other countries would, readjust their policies vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis the United States. And you would have a block of countries that would actively support the Palestinians, which is simply not the case in the Middle East today. And that is down to the fact that these governments have no legitimacy domestically, are not representative of their people, at least as far as this issue is concerned, and are more dependent on external support in some cases for their survival as regimes than they are on the support of their own peoples. And that's a recipe for Israel to dominate this region and for the United States to dominate this region in ways that I think are profoundly unhealthy. I think that democracy is a difficult and complicated thing to deal with, and it's not easy to establish. But it would be better for all concerned, including, frankly, Israel and the United States. It would restrain Israel in ways that I think would save them from plunging headlong into the abyss that they have decided to go into, with this unending occupation that they're projecting for Gaza, and with another attempt to occupy part of Lebanon. Anybody who can look at the history can see that this didn't go well at all, either occupation of Gaza in the past or occupation of parts of Lebanon. These people seem immune to the lessons of history, whether in Washington, where they are backing what Israel is doing in Lebanon, or whether in Israel.
Well, it's been sold to Americans, certainly, as this is a war on terrorism. We're really trying to rein in the terrorists. And the Palestinians have been branded with that meticulously through decades and decades and decades. It's built in. But then suddenly, and you touched on, I want to circle back to what you said earlier, the young people. You're there at Columbia University, which certainly was at the focal point, at least for some time during the last school session. And it looks like, it's shaping up again. What is it about young people that they have seen it and the rest of the leadership of the United States absolutely does not?
Well, I think it's a generational thing, what you're pointing to. Older people are dependent on the mainstream corporate media, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, whatever, New York Times, Washington Post. And there is a rigorous censorship you can't say certain things. If the reporter tries to, the editor will take it out. If the person who writes the script tries to get a certain kind of guest or tries to ask certain kinds of questions, the producers and the executives and the ownership intervene. So, frankly, you have a kind of a soft censorship of the reality of the slaughter of tens of thousands of civilians in Gaza. Tens of thousands of civilians have been slaughtered. Every pretext that Israel gives is as transparent as the day is long. And the mainstream media just repeats whatever Washington wants it to say, and repeats almost verbatim any piece of Israeli propaganda, which they treat with great respect, while basically refusing to give the Palestinians or the Lebanese or anybody else a proper and equal voice. Younger people despise the mainstream media. They pay no attention to it. They don't respect it. And they get their news elsewhere. They get it through alternative media, things like podcasts. They get it from social media. And that means that they're seeing stuff that's good, bad, and indifferent. But they have a range of things to see that are verboten. You cannot see those on mainstream corporate media. You're not allowed to have those views. And if you are, they're hemmed in. I mean, see what happened to Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, what he says, this is what I saw in the West Bank. And he got the most ferocious pushback in a CBS interview. And that's exactly what you get if you dare to express a point of view that's outside of this mainstream of idiocy, which the media sustains, and which is essentially supportive of what our government says and wants, and of what the Israeli government says and wants. You get everything through an Israeli Washington perspective in those media. And students and young people they pay no attention to that. They see on social media and on alternative media what is actually happening. And that has changed them. And that has changed, I think, the calculus in many Western countries. It's not just the United States. It's true also in Western Europe. It's true in the rest of the world. People have access to it.
Is it a permanent phenomenon? In other words, going forward, is Israel going to be less able to control the narrative, as it's done so well with the help of the mainstream media?
Right. I think Israel has lost the battle of the narrative for a large mass of public opinion. I think it still has a hold on the elites, older people who, grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s and are deeply attached to every myth that Israel has promulgated over the decades. And those are the people who own everything. Those are the people who control the media. These are the people who run the law firms, who are on the boards of trustees of universities and so forth. Those people haven't changed, and I would guess will not change. And so there is that narrative is still there, but it is increasingly ignored by larger and larger numbers of people, I think, in the United States and Western countries. And among those people, Israel has completely lost the battle of the narrative, completely. And as those people get older, and as and when they vote, you're beginning to see this in constituencies in England where people who campaigned on the basis of opposition to the Gaza war won seats from Labour. You saw this in France, where voters gave the left-wing party that was opposed the war the largest number of seats in the French National Assembly. They weren't allowed to form a government, of course. Those indicate shifts that are going on at the level of public opinion, which are not at all reflected in elite opinion or in government opinions in Britain, France, or the United States. The administration hasn't budged in its position since day one. And nor have the media, frankly. You pick up the New York Times, I get a better Israeli perspective from the Israeli media than I do from the U.S. media. If you want to know what the Israelis think and see things from Israel's point of view, read the Israeli media. It's a lot more biased, a lot less biased and more objective, and has much more facts than you are allowed to see in the mainstream American media. And I think there's a growing gulf between elite opinion, which I don't think has changed, and between public opinion generally. And you see that in the polls. Majorities of Americans have opposed Biden's policy on Gaza for months and months. Majorities of Americans don't like Netanyahu. Majorities of Americans want to stop arms shipments to Israel. No effect whatsoever on the politicians or the mainstream media. They rarely report those things, if ever. The elite is doing something that is deeply unpopular. They won't say that. Or if they do, it's, in a sidebar.
The book, your most recent, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, but really you bring up the issues that take us right up to today. Why did you write this book so meticulously documented?
Well, I had a couple of reasons. The first was that I felt that there wasn't a decent general history that was approachable and readable for the ordinary reader. And I was urged in this direction by my son and other members of the family who said, you really got to write something for a general public, but at the same time that includes both all of this scholarship that you've done over many years and is rigorous, and at the same time talks about things that you know and you saw and you were involved in. The latter chapters of the book all involve things that I myself witnessed. So the negotiations at Madrid and Washington, or things I saw in the UN Security Council, or what we saw when we were living in Beirut during the 10 years of war there. And so I tried to do both things. I tried to make it readable and approachable through talking about my family and people I knew and my own experiences. And at the same time, it's as well documented as I was able to manage. There are 45.
And you had that library. You had the family library there in Jerusalem, with historic documents dating back more than 100 years that you were able to draw on to give us a picture of how this whole colonialist movement was generated, how it was born, and how it was carried out.
Yeah, the other thing I was trying to do was to break in half this vision of this conflict, of this war, what I call 100 Years' War. It's now much more, obviously, than 100 years, as just between Israelis and Palestinians, or as some age-old conflict. There's no age-old conflict. There was no struggle in Palestine in the 18th century or the 19th century. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. This is a modern phenomenon. It's a result of the eruption of imperialism into the Middle East, the British, and it's a result of the rise of nationalism among Arabs and among Jews. Zionism, Arab nationalism, Palestinian nationalism, and it is a result of the patronage of great powers for the Zionist project and later for the State of Israel. And so it's not just Arabs and Israelis. It's always been Israelis plus Britain, or Zionists plus Britain, or plus the United States and the Soviet Union in 1947 when the partition resolution was passed, or Israel and the United States, both in the battlefield, together, fighting, engaged. I talk about what I call declarations of war. When an American president and Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs meet with an Israeli envoy and say, yes, go ahead, you have green light for war, that's an American-Israeli war. When Secretary Haig meets with Sharon in 1982 and says, yes, I approve that you do this with the PLO, this with Syria, this with Lebanon, that's an American-Israeli war. And then these wars are fought, certainly since the 70s, these wars are fought with American equipment in violation of American law, which says that the use of American weapons should only take place for defensive purposes. And I'm trying to argue this is a war on Palestine to change it from a majority Arab country to what it is today. A country which is completely dominated by Israel, and that every false, framing of it really should be carefully examined. And I offer a framing that's a replacement for it. This idea of a war on Palestine, not just by Israel, but by Israel and the great powers, different great powers at different times. Mainly, of course, the United States.
When I look at it, the United States can often be seen as using Israel as its lever in the Middle East to maintain its power, its own hegemony over that region. And certainly that's the way that Syria, Iran, and others view it. That's why they're so opposed to it. But at the same time, I look at individuals like Bibi Netanyahu who see this as an opportunity right now to do what he's never wanted, a Palestinian state. All right, that's on the record. We know that. But perhaps to carry this a step further, and you talk about this in the book, where, the plan is really to get the Palestinians to leave and leave Palestine to the Israelis. I don't think it's going to happen, but at the same time, they're being put under pressure like we have never seen before in Gaza. I mean, there's nothing left in Gaza. And now they're pulling out the last vestiges of medical aid, and the voices don't seem to be coming up. I mean, Israel just barred 6 more NGOs from operating medical care operations in Gaza.
Right. I think you're right. I think that the objective is either to force the Palestinians out or to force them to submit to whatever it is Israel decides to do with them. And there are now people in the government coalition, ministers, talking about conquer and resettle Gaza and expel. I mean, I just read it this morning in Haaretz, in the Israeli daily.
Well, they're having a conference. I think I read the same article.
One of them said that. That's what we're going to do. We're going to conquer, we're going to expel, and we're going to resettle all of Gaza. Now, that's part of the government. That's not the whole government. But I think it indicates the trend in which this is going, and it indicates what has always been the objective. I quote Jabotinsky, the idea is to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. That's always been the objective. There never was there were people who opposed that within the Zionist movement, but they were always a minority. The dominant trend has always been in that direction. And now I think we're seeing it reach its logical conclusion. Not that I think that's logical or rational. In the 18th or early 19th century, you might have gotten away with the kind of ethnic cleansing that has been going on in Gaza. But I don't think it's possible for them to continue indefinitely doing this in the 21st century. Sooner or later, there has to be pushback. This kind of thing is simply not acceptable. And now the United States is accepting it. As far as the United States is concerned, in spite of the tepid, mushy, insincere, weak, feeble, I could go on and on and on, statements of this administration, they have done absolutely nothing to stop ethnic cleansing. In fact, early on in the war, Blinken ran around as an errand boy for Israel, asking Arab countries if they would take people expelled from Gaza, ethnically cleansed from Gaza, and was told resolutely no by the Egyptian and the Jordanian and the Saudi governments. So the United States was actually complicit in an attempt at an early stage to force people out of Gaza into Egypt, into Jordan, wherever. I frankly don't think this is gonna work. People are desperate in Gaza.
For Israel, they can't. I think they understand that the Palestinians are not going to go willingly. instead of dealing with refugees, they're trying to do away with the word refugees, hence get rid of UNRWA. Anything that mentions refugees or casts Palestinians in that light, because they don't want any right of return, which they promised at the time that Israel was founded.
Well, I mean, I think that if you step back and look at where we are today, I just read a piece by Ryan Crocker in Politico. He was U.S. ambassador, among other things, to Lebanon, to Iraq, to he was everywhere, Pakistan, and he was in Lebanon in 1982. I knew him back in those days. He was the only American official left in the embassy in West Beirut when the rest of the embassy went up to the ambassador's residence up in Hazmiya during the Israeli siege of West Beirut in 1982. And he wrote a piece saying Israelis are delusional if they think that decapitating these movements or reoccupying will do anything but bring them more grief. And I think you have to step back and look at that and say, even if you have the interest of Israel at heart, how can you encourage them to do this? How can you allow them to do this, let alone the interest of the United States? I mean, how does the United States look to the world enabling this aggression? I mean, leave aside what happened on the 7th of October. Leave aside whatever Israel might have done in response to that. What has happened in the year since has a valence of its own. This is an attempted reoccupation of Gaza and parts of South Lebanon. How do you let the Israelis do that? In their interest and in your interest, as an American official or as the U.S. president or as the Secretary of State. I think that the irresponsibility and the frankly, dereliction of duty on the part of U.S. government officials is scandalous. It's disgraceful. In American terms, I would argue from an Israeli point of view, it's extremely dangerous. Israel has put its head into a meat grinder in Lebanon and in Gaza. There's no positive outcome for Israel in this. Whatever they think they're doing, however happy they are with their tactical successes, this is a colossal strategic defeat. Kissinger said it. If the guerrilla doesn't lose, the unconventional force wins. If the conventional army doesn't win, it loses. There's no way they can win in a situation where they're reoccupying parts of Lebanon and Gaza. No possible way. Certainly not in the medium term. Today it may look like that. Tomorrow, 6 years, 6 months, it's not going to look like that.
When we look at it, there's one word, we haven't mentioned it yet, genocide. Do you think that is what is happening right now?
I'm not a lawyer, but everything I've seen from people who are experts on genocide, from legal experts, indicates that that's a really very likely that is what is happening. I have no hesitation in using the term, but again, I'm not a specialist. When you look at the attacks on civilian infrastructure, leave aside the ridiculous claims that every time 300 people are slaughtered, there was one Hamas operative or one Hezbollah operative. Leave that aside. This human shield fig leaf. What kind of human shield can you describe protecting a water purification plant, or a sewage plant, or the entire electrical grid, or every other part of the infrastructure of the Gaza Strip that has been systematically destroyed? Block after block after block of homes, university after university after university, school after this. I mean, this would appear to be genocidal if the word has any meaning. Now, a lot of people are fooled by the idea that genocide has to mean the absolute obliteration of a group. That's not what the definition says, as I read it, and as every international lawyer I've ever looked at reads it. It means the intent to do what they are doing in Gaza. So yes, I would say that is what it looks like.
When we look at it, we try to find some sense out of all of this. The Israeli public has instead been really steeped. We learn everything about every single hostage. They've all been profiled in Israeli media. The Israeli public is convinced that when this is all over, things will just go back to normal. They'll be able to take their separate roads and people will forget about all of this. And they do that on the basis of that's what's happened every time in the past.
Well, except they don't have a long enough memory. Again, I go back to what Ryan Crocker said in his interview with Politico. He was there when Israel launched something called Peace for Galilee in 1982. Well, you may have noticed in the 42 years since, there has not been peace for Galilee. You might notice that what Israel, in effect, did was to trade a relatively weak PLO for a much, much more capable Hezbollah. And those are results of the 1982 invasion and of the slaughter of
I happen to have been there covering the story for
exactly,
CNN
and I was there in West Beirut. 19,000 Lebanese and Palestinians were killed, and that left a mark on Lebanese and Palestinians, which led to the rise of Hezbollah, which led to what Israel is facing today. The idea that going back and doing that again is going to produce any other result than the one that was produced in 1982 is, as Ambassador Crocker said, delusional. They have absolutely no sense of history as their matchless military machine grinds on and slaughters more and more people in Gaza and in Lebanon.
Well, the Israelis had been welcomed into Sidon with rose water and rice. And as the tanks rolled in, because people were glad to be rid of the PLO, which was asserting itself in 82 as a government within a government.
Right.
And then, like you say, occupation, oppression, killings, turned it all around, gave birth to Hezbollah. Now, what everyone describes as the biggest threat to Israel.
Well, you're absolutely right. And it's not just Ryan Crocker who said that. Ehud Barak said it.
Right.
Our occupation of Lebanon created Hezbollah. So heaven knows what comes next. But it is not going to be peace for Galilee. I mean, the return of people to the villages in South Lebanon, to the settlements along the border with Lebanon of Israelis who have been forced to evacuate, is not going to take place because of this military operation. If it takes place, it will take place because of a diplomatic solution, which the Israeli government at this moment has opposed fervently. They're just not going along with anything except imposition of their terms, which is not going to work. If you read what's in the papers, they're talking about Israel will have overflight rights. Israel will be able to operate in South Lebanon as militarily as it chooses. Nobody's going to accept that. And so they will not bring peace to Galilee unless we have a different kind of approach that this government, and I have to say, most of the Israeli public at this point is not willing to contemplate.
The Israeli public, they believe that they can tough it out, that it'll all go away, that all of this pariah state talk will, they'll be able to force students at universities to commit criminal acts by criticizing Israel. They passed laws already in different places in the United States in order to do that. It's a war, as you say, that is ongoing. And in that war, we have to draw some focus on the Palestinian leadership. The failure to hold elections, the failure to bring up young people, the failure to give meaning. Everybody said, well, we want democracy, but they sure don't implement it.
No. People want it, but the leaderships have not allowed it. And that's one of the major Palestinian problems. You need a new leadership, you need a new strategy, and that has to be based on, some democratic process. And
is this an opportunity to do that?
Pardon me?
Is this an opportunity to do that?
I would hope so, but I have a feeling that what the United States wants to do is to impose some puppet leadership, which is what they have now. I mean, one of the reasons you don't have democracy is that the puppets that Israel and the United States have in the so-called Palestinian Authority, a body without authority, are doing their bidding. A democratic election would not return Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas. He's the most unpopular person in Palestine. His leadership is reviled. The authority that he heads is hated. They are seen as tools of an enemy occupation. And the United States and Israel, or more the United States today, and the European countries are upholding that regime. So there are multiple obstacles to democracy. One of them is the United States. The United States does not seem to want democracy in Palestine or in many other parts of the Middle East. I mean, we've seen this over decades. We saw it during the Arab Spring, when the United States and its allies in the Gulf poured billions of dollars into preventing democracy in places like Egypt, in places like Libya, in places like Tunisia, and succeeded in suppressing popular uprisings against dictatorial regimes and installing shattering those countries or installing new dictatorships. So this is a problem that the Palestinians have to deal with. I agree with you. The failure of leadership, the absence of a clear strategy. But it's a problem that's seriously exacerbated by constant intervention in Palestinian politics by the United States, by Europeans, by other countries, by Iran, by other Arab countries.
The Palestinians seem to be under pressure to accept the diktat. Resistance is futile.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things that I think really should be looked at very carefully is what alternatives have been left open to the Palestinians besides resistance, whether violent or nonviolent resistance. I mean, I was involved in Madrid and in Washington in the negotiations that preceded the Oslo talks that led to the Oslo Accords that created the Palestinian Authority. And I've written a book about it, and others have written about it, and others have written about what happened at Camp David in 2000. Anybody who looks very carefully at what was on offer from Israel and the United States was always less than a state, was always some form of maintenance of Israeli occupation. The claim that the United States has supported a two-state solution is absolute and utter nonsense. The United States has always bowed to the Israeli position, which is one state and one Bantustan. Israel will continue to control the Jordan River Valley. Prime Minister Rabin said that in his last speech to the Israeli Knesset before he was assassinated. He said, what we are offering the Palestinians is less than a state. Barak never went further than that in 2000. Olmert never went further than that in the early 2000s. These are different Israeli prime ministers. The Palestinians have never been offered a pathway to an independent, sovereign Palestinian state and self-determination in the 22% of Palestine which was occupied in 1967. Even that has never been on offer. And even less is on offer today. I would argue that even Hamas in its 2017 revised revision of its charter, in its offer in 2006 after the 2006 elections and the formation of a government in 2007, was probably willing to go into some form of two-state solution, but there was no willingness on the other side to accept that. And Israel has since adopted what's called the Israel nation state of the Jewish people law, which says there's only one people with the right of self-determination, which is the Jewish people. So, not only no Palestinian state, no Palestinian people. By constitutional law, I mean, this is a basic law of the Israeli state. In that circumstance, this talk about two-state solution that the United States constantly is floating is, delusional.
Does it have to, therefore, does it have to begin then? Yeah.
They are leaving the Palestinians no options. When people tried to march to the border fence in a peaceful march, hundreds were shot down by snipers who were, safely 100 meters away, picking them off one by one. Thousands were wounded. So what options are there? Basically submit or we'll kick you out. I mean, that's what the finance minister, in a plan that he issued a number of years ago, said. They either submit or they leave or we kill them. And that is actually being actualized and practiced in Gaza over the past year.
Some Palestinians are saying, I don't want to leave, but I'm going to have to leave for the sake of my family. I can't watch my children be slaughtered like this. What does that mean for the future?
Well, it means that the ones who are able to leave, who have the means, who have the resources, who have the talent to find a better future outside, are going to leave. But the overwhelming bulk of the people will not. And that's happening in Lebanon, and it's happened in Lebanon in the past. It seems to be happening to some extent also in Israel. The people with foreign passports, the people with high-tech capabilities, the people who have a base somewhere else, whether in the United States or Europe, a lot of them are leaving. And that's an inevitable result of this. It's obviously much more dire on the Palestinian side. Much, much more dire. And on the Lebanese side, I mean, these are countries under bombardment by the most powerful air force in the Middle East. But it's gonna have a terrible effect on Palestinian society. It's not going to lead to the overwhelming majority of Palestinians leaving. They won't and they can't leave. but it has led already to an exodus from Gaza while the Rafah crossing was open until Israel occupied it a number of months ago and closed it.
Is there any hope on the horizon?
I wish I could say in the short term there is, but I don't think in the short term there is. I think in the longer term, yes, there is hope on the horizon. I don't think that publics in the West, unless we go into a really very right-wing authoritarian turn in Western democracies, where the kind of use of force that Israel is addicted to is seen as manly and welcome. But unless that happens, I don't think that what the kind of approach that Israel has to this, which is force and more force and a refusal under any circumstances to compromise, is going to find support in Western countries, without which Israel is helpless. The bombs are American. The money is American. The diplomatic support is American and Western European. And when the elites finally come to their senses in Western Europe and the United States and realize that this is not in their interest, then I see a possibility of hope. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. These people right now in Washington and London, Paris and Berlin, they're impervious. And the masters of the media, they're impervious to the kinds of considerations that most people now are taking into account in most parts of the United States and Western Europe. When and if that affects our leaders, then I think there is a possibility of hope.
The book is The 100 Years' War on Palestine. Its author, Professor Rashid Khalidi, has been our guest on The Brief. Thank you. Thank you very much for your views, and I hope we can continue this conversation in the future.
I look forward to that. I hope we'll be able to do that. Thank you so much, Jim.
And we thank you for joining us. Please explore many of our other episodes of The Brief Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Give us a like or subscribe. For a complete listing, you can find more information at thebriefpodcast.org. Thanks, and you've been briefed.